Now, what do? What happens next? I just imagine those were some of the questions those first disciples were asking themselves. I mean, their teacher, their beloved rabbi, had been arrested and crucified. He'd been buried, and now the tomb was empty. Those disciples must have had just hearts full of grief and heads full of confusion, wondering what they were supposed to do now. What would happen next? What did it all mean? They must have been worried for their own safety. Were they going to be the next to be arrested? Did any of it actually mean anything? Was Jesus who he said he was? Was he actually the Son of God? Would they actually decide to continue to try to follow what he had taught? Should they try to live the faithful lives that Jesus had talked about, preached about, and had actually lived? What did it all mean? Sad, afraid, confused. Those disciples must have just been wondering, what do we do now? If you happen to have been a longtime Grey's Anatomy fan, you might remember a scene with similar emotions. Way back when the show first started, one of the central characters was George O'Malley. He was a young surgical intern, very likable. And in one episode, his father comes to the hospital where George works in order to have surgery. It's a very risky surgery, but it's the only possible way to save George's father's life. And so the father insists on having the surgery, despite the fact that it's very risky. But unfortunately, the father's body, it was just too diseased, it was too hurt, and he was not really able to survive the surgery. Just a few days later, life support was removed from him. And George, his whole world is shattered. He no longer has faith in medicine. He loses his trust in his fellow surgeons. And in this one scene, he's outside the hospital, and he looks at a friend and says, "I don't know how to exist in a world where my Father is not." Can't you hear those disciples almost saying the same thing? We don't know how to exist in a world where Jesus is not. And yet, after a while, after the grief and the fear began to settle down, those disciples, they just had to start remembering that Jesus did not leave them without resources. Jesus left them so very much before he left this earthly life. He left them a legacy of lessons and experiences upon which they could draw so that their faith could be strengthened and renewed, so that their faith could stay alive. So they must have started to remember some of the sermons, like that one he did on a mountain where he talked about people being blessed. Or maybe they would remember that picnic by the Sea of Galilee where Jesus fed thousands of people with just a loaf of bread and some fish. Or the blind man who suddenly could see, or all of the outcasts that became friends. Or maybe they remembered this bread and this cup. Because during their last meal together, Jesus broke bread and he took a cup. And he said, "When you do this, remember me." He was offering to those disciples ways to remember, ways to have their faith strengthened. And when you share the cup, when you break this bread, you will remember me, and your faith can become strong and can become ever more alive. It's interesting in that passage that Kent just read, where the disciples are walking along the road to Emmaus, and this guy joins them, and they start talking to the guy, and they say, "What, you haven't heard about everything that happened in Jerusalem?" Well, it wasn't until they broke bread together that then they realized that they were actually walking with Jesus. There's something about this bread and this cup that puts us in touch with the risen one. And then our faith, we can hold on to it. We can have the tenacity to have a faith that is strengthened. So during that meal, after it was over, Jesus took bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body and it's broken for you." In those words, I hear Jesus saying, you know what? My body's going to be broken. My body is going to be hurt. But I promise you that I will still remain present to you. I will still be here, available to you, to hold you up, to strengthen you, to nourish you, to encourage your faith. Yes, my earthly body will be hurt, but I will still be present to you. There's a story about a missionary in India. He was translating the New Testament into one of the many dialects of India. And on this particular day, he was really struggling to come up with a word in the dialect for the word faith. And he was having a really hard time coming up with a specific word for that. And a little boy came into the area where he was working, and he was so intent on his translation that he said to the boy, "Could you just have a seat over there, and in a few minutes I'll be with you." And so the translator went back to his work. And then he noticed that the boy wasn't actually sitting in the chair, but instead he was kind of walking around it, taking a look at it from all different angles. And then the translator realized that he was in such a primitive village that that little boy had probably never seen a Western-style chair before. And so he was clearly inspecting it, trying to figure out if this flimsy thing was going to be able to hold up his weight. And then the boy asked the translator a question, and in it was a word that said, "If I give myself to this, will it hold me?" And the translator knew he had the word for faith. If I give myself to this, will it hold me? In breaking of the bread, Jesus was saying, I'll be there. I'll be able to hold you. I will sustain you. My earthly body will be hurt, but I will still be present to you, and I will hold up your faith. There's a theologian who wrote about a conversation he had with a couple of circus employees. They were trapeze artists, and those artists were talking about their very unique relationship. And they talked about how there was the catcher, and the catcher is the person that is on the swing with the knees, and the flyer, who's the person that lets go. And so in this description, they talked about how the flyer has to let go of the swing, lift up the arms up into space, and then try to stay as completely still as possible. And then it is the catcher's job to catch the flyer. And what's critical is for the flyer not to reach for the catcher. It only works when the catcher reaches out for the flyer. It goes against every single piece of human instinct for survival to imagine flying through the air and hope you get caught. But that's what Jesus was saying in this breaking of bread. When I'm gone, it might feel like you're flying through air and you're not sure which direction to go, but I will catch you, and I will hold up, and I will sustain your faith. So on that night, when Jesus was having that meal with his disciples, he took bread and he broke it and he said, "This is my body, and it is broken for you." And during that same meal, Jesus took a cup, and he said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me." With that cup, Jesus was introducing a new covenant, a new relationship between God and humanity, between God and people. Up to this point, the relationship between God and people had numerous aspects to it. It included following the 613 laws of Moses, making sacrifices in the temple, having your relationship mediated by the priests. And here Jesus was saying, This is a new covenant. There will be a new way to relate to God. It is a relationship that is based on love. And individuals, each one of us, can be in relationship with God and share in that loving relationship. With this cup, Jesus was saying, God will love us when we're at our most faithful, and God will love us when we're not doing our best. God loved those disciples when they were following the path of Jesus, and God loved them when they were struggling a little bit. God will love us even when, or maybe especially when, we're struggling to be at our best, when we have a hard time showing our best selves. The new covenant says that God will love us each day when we're doing well, when we're struggling, when life feels overwhelming. There's a story about a mom who came upon her 6-year-old son. She was just busy doing chores, and she came upon her 6-year-old son, and he was just sitting there sobbing. And she said to him, "What's wrong? Why are you crying?" And he said, "Because I just tied my shoes." And she said, "Well, that seems great. You learned a new skill, you're growing up, you're becoming more and more capable of doing things for yourself." And he said, "Yes, now I'm going to have to tie my own shoes every day for the rest of my life." There are times when life just feels too much, doesn't it? The daily chores are just so overwhelming. We can't possibly cook another meal. We can't go to the grocery store. We can't participate in another committee meeting. We can't come be part of another service project. It's just too much. God will love us through those moments when life feels just too difficult. God loves us even when we have a hard time showing our very best selves. Reverend Julie Pennington Russell told a story about a morning when she and her husband, Tim, were just trying to get the family ready like they always do. They had 2 kids, Lucy, who was 7, and Taylor, who was 11. So it was a regular morning, trying to get everybody up, showered, dressed, fed, and packed for the day of school or for work. And on this particular morning, Lucy came in and said she wanted to make breakfast special. Could she please have a candle on the breakfast table? And so Tim went in with Lucy and helped her light the candle, and then he went to check his email. Well, a few minutes later, Taylor, the 11-year-old, comes running in and says, "Lucy's on fire!" And sure enough, Lucy had leaned over too close to the candle, and her hair was ablaze. And so Reverend Julie had to grab her bathrobe and put her daughter's hair out. But of course, by then the stench of burned hair was already permeating the house. And Taylor and his friend actually got physically sick, maybe because of their fear, but also because of the stench. And so the minister said, "There I am at 6:45 in the morning. My bathrobe is burned. I'm picking ashes out of my daughter's hair. There's sickness all over the floor. How did my life go ballistic before 7 o'clock in the morning?" We have days like that, don't we? When life just feels out of control. Maybe it's because we take on too many responsibilities. We decide we want to help lead a march. Maybe it's because we've decided to be part of another community organization, but there's just so much going on and we just can't handle it and life feels out of control. And what this new covenant says is God will love us through it. God will help us meet our commitments. God will help us when life feels out of control. The new covenant says God is present to us in the big moments, tragic moments, difficult moments, but in those everyday moments when we just need a little extra love to get us through. Jesus took the cup and said, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink of it in remembrance of me."